And welcome to another Deep Thinkers meeting. Tonight we're going to talk about slavery, but traditionally and in the headlines, slavery is usually associated with the transatlantic slave trade and taking Africans across the Atlantic to North America. This transatlantic slave trade was abolished 200 years ago, but obviously the legacy continues. However, I think we're having the wrong conversation about slavery. There's about 50 million people around the world are now living in modern day slavery. Those figures go back to 2021. And there was a report by the international rights group called Walk Free, and they suggest that the figure has increased by 10 million in the past 5 years. The reasons are complex, but extreme weather conditions, forced migration, and armed conflicts are exposing entire communities to exploitation. Low incomes are often at the centre of this issue, but findings show that consumerism and demands from rich nations are contributing to the problem. So what's being done about it? What can we do to stop it? Well, what types of modern slavery are there? Well, let's begin with the obvious, the forced labour. Approximately 25 million people are in forced labour worldwide, and this includes people working under coercion, debt bondage, and other forms of exploitation. There's human trafficking, and this is a significant component of modern slavery today. Millions of people are trafficked annually for various purposes, including sexual exploitation and forced labour. There's child labour, and in 2020 it was estimated that 152 million children were engaged in child labour, with almost half engaged in hazardous work. The economic impact is that illicit profits generated by forced labourers were estimated at $150 billion annually. Similarly, human trafficking is estimated to be worth $150 billion worldwide. So here is the world map of modern slavery as recorded in 2018. This is taken from the website How Much, and the colour codes show the concentrations or by numbers. It makes New Zealand look quite good. However, that doesn't mean there's 0 slaves. There are thousands of slaves working in New Zealand, and that's one of the better countries. Geographic distribution, well, it's all over the world. Modern slavery exists in every region of the world, but it's most prevalent in Asia and the Pacific, followed by Africa and the Americas. In terms of prevalence by population, countries such as North Korea, Eritrea, Libya, Mauritania have some of the highest rates of modern slavery. They can come from virtually any country in the world. However, some regions are more commonly associated with trafficking of victims, such as Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of South Asia. In some cases, victims are transported across borders, so it's difficult to trace their origins. So who are the victims? And the victims are many. Let's start with vulnerable populations, migrants and refugees. Many victims of modern slavery are migrants or refugees seeking better opportunities or fleeing conflict and persecution. The precarious legal status in foreign countries can make them easy targets for exploitation. There's also marginalised communities. People from marginalised or minority communities, either by class or race or ethnicity, are usually at a higher risk due to the social discrimination within that country and lack of access to education and employment activities. Poverty-stricken individuals, well, economic depression can drive individuals and families into situations where they become vulnerable to exploitation. Second class of victims are children. Child labour. Children are often forced into labour at an early age, depriving them of education and a normal childhood. Terrible occupation is child soldiers. Some children are forced into the army and to act as soldiers. Some are forced into marriage. Some child marriage is seen as a problem, and it's seen as a form of modern slavery, affecting girls who are married off against their will. Women and girls are a big proportion of modern slaves. Women and girls represent a significant proportion of the victims of forced labour and human trafficking, with many subjected to sexual exploitation. They are disproportionately affected by sexual exploitation, including forced prostitution, sex trafficking, and forced marriages. The other half of it is domestic servitude. Many women and girls are subjected to forced labour and domestic settings. But there are men and boys involved in modern slavery. They're usually in the forced labour business. They're victims of forced labour in industries such as agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. There's also debt bondage. So some people get trapped in debt, and that compels them to work to repay these loans, often at extreme interest rates and often under exploitative conditions. The fifth category is slightly more modern. It's online exploitation. So in these days of the digital age, victims can be targeted online, including through sexual exploitation, forced webcam performances, and other performances of cyber exploitation. So slavery is seen in the products of our supply chains. One of the causes is globalization and outsourcing, because companies want to find cheaper costs, particularly labour costs, and want to move to countries with less stringent regulations to save costs. This creates opportunities for exploitation where labour standards are not adequately enforced. They can sometimes use labour brokers to form subcontractors. And these multiple layers of contracts can hide or obscure the true source of the product and the labour, making it difficult to monitor and enforce these labour standards. There's a significant lack of transparency. You can't see the full depths of the global supply chains, and that limits the visibility of the conditions of workers at various tiers. And this allows companies to turn a blind eye to abusive practices further down the supply chain because they can't see them. Low-cost labour markets, well, regions with lower cost and weaker labour protections often are attractive to companies seeking to minimise costs. These areas often lack adequate oversight and enforcement mechanisms. Forced labour and debt bondage, well, workers in these regions fall victim to forced labour and debt bondage, where they are coerced to work to repay debts, often under exploitative conditions. So they're tempted into a job, they're promised good pay, but they forget the amount they have to pay in return for their transportation, their accommodation, and that racks up a debt that can find very difficult to pay. Their recruitment practices are often unethical, so unscrupulous recruiters will place fraudulent job offers to document and steal their documents, basically take their passports off them when they arrive in the new country. Many of the countries engaged in modern slavery are lacking in the regulations, or at least they're lacking in the enforcement of the existing regulations. So weak and corrupt laws and weak and corrupt enforcement of regulation creates this environment where exploitative practices can flourish without consequences. The supply chains, as we've seen, are complex, and they're getting more complex in a globalized world. So you've got multiple suppliers, multiple intermediaries, and so it makes it challenging to trace the origin of that product or that labour. However, we are all to blame. The consumers demand the low prices, and that demand will put pressure on companies to cut costs, potentially leading to cost-saving measures that compromise labour standards. Most companies don't bother with due diligence, and they will turn a blind eye to the labour conditions in their supply chain, especially if it makes making more money and more profit, regardless of the sourcing. So what are the products affected and used or created in this globalized slave trade? The obvious one is cocoa and chocolate. In the Ivory Coast and Ghana in particular, the cocoa industry has seen child labour and forced labour produce the cocoa and chocolate that we eat. Coffee, we all like our coffee, but in some areas, particularly South America and Africa, it's been linked to exploitative labour practices. Garments and textiles, fashion one is fast fashion. The fashion industry has faced allegations of exploitations, particularly in countries with low labour costs, where workers may face poor working conditions and low wages. So the prime victim of this is the fast fashion, where you buy very cheap garments from low paid workers or no paid workers. Electronics. Electronic manufacturing is usually outsourced, and it's often outsourced to countries like China and Southeast Asia, and they're associated with harsh working conditions as well as forced labour. The list goes on. So in farming, it's connected with forced labour and child practices around the world. Fishing and seafood in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa in particular. We have human trafficking involved in that trade, as well as forced labour aboard the fishing vessels. Mining, extraction of minerals, that's including copper and cobalt, and the raw materials that go to make modern electronic equipment and your electric cars. They're often done in dangerous working conditions, possibly in conflict zones, and involve the exploitation of usually young people. Brickmaking and construction, known for quite some time that some countries employ workers either under coercive conditions or under debt bondage, for example. The list goes on. Nail salons, beauty salons. So it's been reported in nail salons and beauty services in some countries with workers subject to long hours and low wages as well, not usually kept in the greatest conditions. Domestic work, well, domestic slaves are still alive and well, and domestic workers, usually migrants, can be vulnerable to exploitation and abuse in private households. Agricultural plantations, similar to the farmer, particularly palm oil, rubber and sugarcane, are noted to use forced labour and poor working conditions. Biggest and fastest growing is sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is a form of modern slavery and involves commercial sexual exploitation of individuals, usually women and children. Manufacturing and sweatshops, well, we've seen factories and clothing manufacturing companies collapse due to the unsafe working conditions that these poor people are working in. So how do we do it? How do we come around? What can we do? So at least on the supply chain side, we can have better management. So you could do a supply chain audit. Surely it must be possible to trace the origin of your product. One example, if you can slap on that your product is GMO free, why on earth can you not slap on it that it's slavery free? We would expect to hold manufacturers and suppliers and transportation companies, logistics companies, the whole supply chain to sign up to a code of conduct that sets clear expectations for the suppliers and contractors regarding labour practices. And it all has to be transparent. So transparent reporting from one end of the supply chain to the other, and that should expose and prevent the unethical practices. Yes, it will require legislation. So some countries already have it and some countries enforce it, but sadly many don't. So to address modern slavery in the supply chain, it needs collaboration among the governments, among businesses, non-governmental organisations and consumers. And I think the last one is probably the most important. With that, you can create a more ethical and transparent global production network. So where did all this come from? Well, these are some of the resources, but there were many, many more. It doesn't take a great deal of research to find out this information. And I'd just like to finish with a little video.